President Trump has now said that Zelenskyy is a dictator, and he's really flipping the script on the whole Ukraine-Russia situation. And joining me to break it all down is Jason Buttrill, former Defense Department intelligence analyst and head writer, researcher for the Glenn Beck Program. Hey, Jason.
Hey, Dan. Thanks for having me on, man.
All right, yeah. I wanted you on because help me make sense of this. Help me make sense of everything that's going on. I feel like we're in this shift, this sort of, I don't know, tectonic plate shift of foreign policy where all of the kind of old things are being thrown out. So what do you see that's happening, as far as, I mean, where do you want to start on this? Like, where do you think is the best way to sort of try to explain to people what is happening right now as far as like how Trump sees it with Russia and Ukraine?
Wow, where to begin?
It's a lot.
Yeah, I think we're in a very odd point as far as foreign policy and geopolitics are concerned in the entire world really. But Ukraine is serving as a flashpoint for that right now. I think that just kind of extrapolating, we're going to see this happen a lot. We're going to see this happen in the Middle East. We're going to see this happen all over the world as power is redistributed. As new power nations start to rise, others start to fall. But we're starting to see an end of this sounds weird to say, but the end of the Cold War era, which you hear that and you think, okay, well, shouldn't that have happened at the end of the Cold War?
Right.
Well, I don't think it has, because let me put this and this is a big setup, but let me put this in personal, make it personal for me. It's hard for me to think about geopolitics with no emotion whatsoever and just say, okay, this is what's happening in the world. This is why these are the interests of these countries. It's hard for me to think that way in places like Afghanistan because it's deeply personal for me. I, was part of the, initial wave, the first, invasion force into Afghanistan after 9/11. So me talking about, well, we should have gotten out of Afghanistan, we shouldn't have, whatever. I have an emotional attachment to Afghanistan, which needs to be purged from my thought, and I need to not look at it in those ways. Well, the old order is looking at Ukraine and Russia. People like, people that fought the Cold War, people that orchestrated a lot of our strategy, people like, Zbigniew Brzezinski, those types of people. That thought pattern of we need to expand, NATO, we need to expand our containment strategy, for instance, against the Soviet Union, they think that needs to continue. And we won the war, and rightfully we should continue to press on with it. Look, I can understand that because that's kind of how I felt with Afghanistan. Well, right now we're looking at a new way of thinking in this region. We're thinking about, well, how do we engage with Russia? Is Russia's thought pattern and interest the same as what they were during the Cold War and post World War II? Are they exactly the same? So, and when I say that, are they going to continue to if we allow them to do what they did in Ukraine, are they going to continue to push on and do it in, let's say, Poland or another nation and push their borders past to what they were just before the fall of the Soviet Union? That's what the old order thinks is going to happen with Ukraine. So I think that in that big, extremely long setup, I think that the way that, for instance, like the Biden administration handled Ukraine, it was definitely that old way of thinking. I think the Trump administration looked at this in a completely different way back in 2017. They wanted to change the way it was. They wanted to change how NATO works. And for instance, if you think about NATO it might be the only still standing alliance that exists when its original purpose and intent no longer exists, which is a very, very odd thing. I love NATO for what it stood for and what it accomplished. It did amazing things. But when you think about this with no emotion, why does NATO still exist today? Think about it. Like, what is their purpose? Is it to contain the Soviet Union? It can't be that, because the Soviet Union does not exist. So does it purport to, contain an ideology that they think Russia still holds? Is that what it is?
Yeah,
because go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, because what is Putin's motive here? I mean, it feels like that's sort of the gamble here with either side of these foreign policies, right? Is what does Putin actually want to do? Like, is he aiming for, what's your take on what he wants to do? Is he actually aiming for the reunification? Is it sort of like we need to bring back the glory days of the Soviet Empire? I mean, is that what he's trying to do? Or does he have another motive?
So it's interesting you asked that, because I feel like I haven't heard anyone actually ask that question since everything started. And you going back to 2014, when really, a lot of this started. Like, not too many people have been willing to say, what does Russia want? What does Putin want? That seems like kind of an important question to ask, and at least attempt to be, intellectually honest on, if you want to see this matter resolved. But it doesn't feel like that's been the case. We've been told time and time again, oh, well, he wants to invade because he wants to continue to spread his borders out. I will say that there is a very real geopolitical, imperative by Russia. Throughout the years, they've been invaded from the West, and it has been their geopolitical strategy to push their borders out so that they get strategic depth from their capital city of Moscow and an enemy on their western flank. That has been that was in the Soviet Union. That's why they pushed all the way as far as they could to Berlin. That's always been, their strategy. Now, Putin does not want, knowing strategic depth, but also being realistic, they're never going to push their borders out to where it was, right after World War II during the Cold War. They're never going to do that. So you either think that Putin is crazy, or that some concessions should have been made back when all of this really started to come coming to a head back around 2014. There was
concessions by Ukraine,
concessions by the Western world, and concessions by Russia. Yeah, it's really horrible, because you can look at when you're asking these questions or having these conversations, it's hard not to sound heartless, especially like for the Ukrainians, because let's just put it out, so it's not misunderstood. Russia was completely in the wrong for invading Ukraine. Yeah. It is an absolute tragedy what happened in Ukraine. Hundreds of thousands of people have died. I don't even know what the actual number is on the Ukrainian side and the Russian side, but Russia is completely at fault for that. They just are. They were the ones that did it, so they are at fault. But you have to look at what your exact question. What do the Russians want off of this? And you just go back to what they said. They did not want Ukraine part of NATO. They did not want Ukraine part of NATO. And even if not given the exact title, they didn't want a, I guess
of some sort.
Yeah, heavily aligned to the United States, or the West.
Right, even if they weren't officially in NATO, right?
Right.
It's just like a handshake sort of thing.
Correct. Right. Because their number one geopolitical strategy on this is to have their capital as insulated as possible. Now, it's not insulated at all if you have a NATO country or a heavily allied country right within 400 miles of Moscow. That's very, very dangerous for them. So I guess the juggling act for ever since the 90s was what's going too far? Is it going too far to allow this country to join NATO, this country to join NATO, this country to join NATO? What's going too far? That's always been Ukraine. Ukraine has always been that's the point at which you cannot move any forward. We've known this. Russia's not going to allow that. So you're looking at talks now that are springing up to where you finally have an administration, the Trump administration, that is willing to actually sit down and speak. They were not even speaking. You finally have negotiators just saying, look, what exactly do you want? And I would love to be sitting in there, be a fly on the wall, because I'm sure they're saying the exact same things. Now, the problem is the Western establishment is not even listening. And you see it in the media. They'll be like, oh, no, you can't listen to it. It's got to be absolute victory. Putin just wants to, take over the world. You're never going to negotiate and reach any kind of beneficial on all sides agreement with that kind of attitude. It's a horrible reality, but there are going to be losers on both sides. Yeah. And there's going to be some wins on both sides. But
do you think because Trump calling Zelenskyy a dictator, I mean, if that's the standard, then clearly Putin would be a dictator too. Do you think Trump's doing that just to sort of get Russia to the table, to sort of because I'm sure Putin liked that, right? Like, I'm sure he was like, if he had to look at the way Trump is saying things, that one he would probably agree with. Is that a way to sort of get Putin to the table? And and I know we're running out of time here, but I guess as far as concessions go, right? Ukraine's looking at losing these strips of land here. What would be the concession for Russia, and what do you think the next steps are here in as far as where they're at here in these talks?
The Trump strategy, I guess, really in everything foreign policy related, or almost everything, period, has always been unpredictability, which I think is you can't teach it. You just either have it or you don't have it. And he has it on this. And I think that, he's doing a lot of things. He's saying a lot of things out in public that are really kind of setting both the Russians and the Ukrainians back. Like, what does he actually mean by this? So on one case, he might throw out the dictator thing, which I'm not entirely sure at all what he's trying to do there. It could be to bring in some of the hardliner members back, to the negotiating table on the Russian side. I don't know. But then on the other hand, he almost appears to extend an olive branch to the Ukrainians. What was this, a couple weeks before, and was like, well, let's negotiate. Let's see, what about precious minerals? Maybe there's a deal that can be struck there, between the aid that we do give you and what you're paying for us in return. So that signals back to Russia, okay, wait a minute. Is he dealing with them or is he dealing with us? You know what I mean? It's unpredictability, I think. And I think that he's trying to send this message that, the United States is going to act in its own interests, not like a phantom interest of something that existed back during the Cold War. Yeah. We're kind of going to reset the alignment on this. And really, it's way past time for, to the allies of NATO to reevaluate who exactly is this, what exactly is this war about? And a lot of people and a lot of people watching this right now might be, curious about, why is only the United States there at the table and Russia? Well, it benefits everyone to just cut through all the bull and say what this war is really all about. This is a proxy war. It's the United States and a U.S.-led coalition versus Russia. And sadly, the Ukrainians are caught in the middle on this. Yeah. And it's very, very tragic. But we need to establish that right from the start. And even if you don't believe that, that's what Russia believes. So we need to establish that right from the beginning. And that's why this is so dangerous. Because people they're like, oh, let's just go to war and let's just, victory or nothing for Ukraine. Well, it's not that easy. Because when you boil this down to the basics, this is a United States versus Russia conflict. It's a proxy war. When you have the two largest nuclear powers in play here in a direct war like this, bad things can happen if you're willing to take it out to finality.
Yeah, so no, it's definitely a dangerous game. And listen, Jason, I know you got to go, and we're just scratching the surface here. But I'd love to have you back on again. Maybe we get a little bit more breathing room, and to discuss this a little bit further, because I know we're just scratching the surface on this. But Jason Buttrill, former Department of Defense and Chief Researcher, Head Writer at Glenn Beck Program. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.